I've talked before about MLB players who were held as POWs during World War II. That episode didn't draw many eyeballs for whatever reason, but I have to tell you that's probably the episode I'm most proud of. A lot of research went into that, and the stories of the guys that I talk about in that video, they need to be heard. Regardless, today I want to touch on a similar topic. To the best of my knowledge, there were 6 professional baseball players who died during Operation Overlord on June 6, 1944, the D-Day invasion of Normandy. There isn't a ton of information on these men, but the information I was able to glean primarily came from the book written by Gary Bedingfield titled Baseball's Dead of World War II. I want to specifically thank David Reed for sending me a copy of Gary's book. Appreciate it, David. Joe Pinder, Lefty Brewer, Elmer Wright, Louis Albarijo, Frank Draper, and Maurice Williams. Each of these men died that morning on the beaches of France. John J. or Joe Pinder, Jr. was ironically born on June 6 in 1912. He was the oldest of the 6 men, dying on his birthday at age 32. Joe was a technician 5th grade in HQ Company, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, U.S. Army. He was a right-handed pitcher who grew up in the steel mill towns of Pennsylvania. The highest level of baseball for Joe was pitching for the Macon Peaches of the South Atlantic League. He entered military service in January of 1942, attending Army basic training at Camp Wheeler, Georgia, Fort Benning, Georgia, and Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, before leaving for England with the 16th Infantry Regiment, the Big Red 1, 1st Infantry Division. In November of 1942, the division left England and took part in the Allied landings of North Africa at Algeria and the battles against Rommel's Africa landings in Sicily, and then slogged through the island's mountains where some of the heaviest fighting of the Sicilian campaign took place. By November of 1943, Technician 5th grade Pinder was a 1-year combat veteran back in England preparing for D-Day. Meanwhile, his brother Harold, now a 1st lieutenant and bomber pilot with the 44th Bomb Group, which was also stationed in England, was shot down on a raid over Europe on January 29 of 44. With the help of the Belgian resistance, he managed to avoid capture until April, when he was rounded up by German troops and spent the remainder of the war at Stalag Luft III. Shameless plug, again. I talk quite a bit about Stalag Luft III in my POW video. Mickey Grasso and Augie Donatelli were held at Stalag Luft III. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the 16th Infantry Regiment was in the first wave of troops to assault the beach. As the landing crafts approached, the Germans opened fire with artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire. An artillery shell exploded close to Pinder's landing craft, tearing holes in the boat and causing carnage among the men inside. For those that survived, Pinder included, panic set in as the vessel filled with water and began to sink. They were still 100 yards from the beach when the ramp was dropped, and they were instantly met with a hail of deadly accurate machine gun and small arms fire, killing many outright as they struggled to reach the shore. If you've seen Saving Private Ryan, I'm sure you can imagine what Pinder was facing in that moment. Joe was determined to do what he was there for, to ensure vital radio equipment made it to the beach so that a line of communication could be established. He grabbed a radio and placed it on his shoulder amid the deafening sound of gunfire. He made his way down the ramp and into the waves. With the air filled with small arms fire and exploding artillery, it was only a matter of time before Pinder was hit. As he waded through the water, a bullet clipped him, causing him to stumble, but he did not stop. Eyewitness reports that another bullet ripped through the left side of his face, and he held the gaping flesh in place as he carried on. Pinder made it to the beach, dropped the radio, and returned to the water to retrieve more equipment. Then, instead of looking for somewhere to protect himself, he returned a third time to collect essential spare parts and code books. And again, he was hit as a burst of machine gun fire, sadly, tore through his upper body. He fell, then somehow, amazingly struggled to his feet, and with his last ounce of energy, made it to the beach with the radio equipment. Moments later, he would pass out from a loss of blood and died. Joe Pinder had made the ultimate sacrifice in helping to establish vital radio communication on Omaha Beach. In January of 1945, Pinder was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. Lefty Brewer. Forrest Brewer was born just outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee in 1918. Nicknamed Lefty, he was a pitcher who made it as high as spring training with the Washington Senators in 1939 before being released to the Charlotte Hornets of the Class B Piedmont League. On March 4 of 1941, 1 week before reporting to spring training with the Senators, he was drafted into military service with the Army at Camp Blanding, Florida. He volunteered to serve as a paratrooper in January of 1942 and was sent to parachute jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia. Brewer became a platoon sergeant with Company B of the newly formed 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment at Camp Blanding in October of 42. In April of 43, the 508th relocated to Camp McCall in North Carolina. Training there was intense. At 24 years old and a veteran of 18 jumps, Brewer admitted to the Charlotte Observer in 1943 that he was still in a sweat before every jump. He said, quote, "Some fellows say that they get used to jumping, but don't you believe it. Every time you get up to the door of that plane and look out into space, you get the same old feeling. And if you ain't looking, you just sit there and you know that there's a big hunk of air out there. I love my wife, but I told her there was one thing that I loved even more, and that was seeing that parachute open up over my head." The 508th arrived in Belfast, Northern Ireland in January of 44, attached to the 82nd Airborne Division, and participated in night training maneuvers while waiting for the inevitable invasion of mainland Europe. On June 4, they were ready to take off, but weather forced a delay. The following night, Brewer and men of the 508th, with their faces blackened and their hearts racing, boarded C-47s for the flight across the English Channel. D-Day had begun, and the paratroopers would spearhead the invasion. C-47s were stark inside. A row of hard metal bucket seats lined both sides of the plane, and the roar of the engines drowned out any attempt at conversation as they flew through the dark skies towards the Normandy coast. Once over the mainland of France, the sky became illuminated with searchlights and deadly tracer bullets, piercing the wings and fuselage of the unarmed and unarmored planes. Anti-aircraft fire exploded all around as they neared their drop zones at an altitude of only 400 feet. When the red light over the door of the plane flashed on, everybody stood up and clamped themselves onto the cable that ran down the ceiling of the plane. Lefty Brewer and 24,000 Allied paratroopers just like him descended through the darkness into chaos and confusion. If you know much about what happened on D-Day, you're probably aware that many of the airborne paratroopers were dropped far from their targets. Whether due to inexperienced pilots or just mass mayhem is unclear, but the majority of the 508th found themselves too far east with the enemy all around. About 2 miles east of the original drop zone. And in the words of Bill Dean, who had served with Brewer for more than 2 years, quote, "One hell of a firefight erupted." Despite heavy resistance, the attack was successful, and the paratroopers then followed the causeway to the bridge that spanned the river to join the rest of the 508th. At about 2:30 p.m., they were counterattacked by an overwhelming German force of tanks and heavily armed infantry that blocked the paratroopers' return across the bridge. Trapped in a hail of gunfire and explosions, Brewer ran for his life towards the river. Bill Dean was running as hard as anyone. He recalled, quote, "As I ran for the river, I was aware someone was running hard just behind me, and in my panic, I took a quick look and saw Lefty running like he was going to stretch a triple into a home run." A split second later, there was a burst of machine gun fire, and Lefty Brewer fell face down into the river. Exactly 6 years after pitching a no-hitter with the St. Augustine Saints, Lefty Brewer's life ended. Elmer Wright, Frank Draper, and Maurice Williams. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of Bedford, Virginia. I lived in Virginia for 5 years. It's a small community with a tragic connection to World War II. No single town in America suffered more loss per capita on D-Day than Bedford. Elmer Wright and Frank Draper were both professional ball players from Bedford who were among those losses. I'm also grouping Maurice Williams in here. Maurice was living in Fairfax, Virginia at the time. He was a ball player who would end up joining the Bedford Boys as part of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division. Elmer Wright was the son of the town's deputy sheriff, Howard Wright. Elmer was a standout athlete at Bedford High School. He was a tackle in football and a pitcher on the baseball team. In the spring of 1937, Wright, aged 21, was signed by the St. Louis Browns and assigned to the Terre Haute Tots of the Class B 3I League. Frank Draper played baseball for Mud Alley, a tough local team, and starred with Bedford High School in baseball, football, basketball, and track. Later on, he became the center fielder and leadoff hitter with the semi-pro Hampton Looms. After graduating from high school, both Bedford men joined Company A of the local National Guard. As the war in Europe took hold during 1940, the United States began expanding its fighting forces. In October, it was announced that Bedford's National Guard Company A would be mobilized into the Federal Army for a period of 1 year. And on February 3rd of 1941, Wright and the other members of Company A reported to the Bedford Armory. They were sent to Fort Meade, Maryland, home of the 29th Infantry Division, and during the summer of 41, Wright regularly had the opportunity to pitch for the Fort Meade post team. While at Fort Meade, news was received of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It ended all hope of being home in a year. In August of 42, the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division, left Fort Meade, bound for Camp Blanding in Florida. Less than a month later, they boarded a train that took them to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, staging post to Britain. A staggering total of 11,000 troops boarded the Queen Mary for the Atlantic, crossing with an escort of 5 destroyers and a British cruiser, the HMS Curaçao. As the Queen Mary approached Scotland, the Curaçao guided her into the Firth of Clyde. It was a routine operation, but at 12:12 p.m. on October 2nd, 1942, disaster struck. The Queen Mary somehow collided with the Curaçao. The huge ocean liner suffered minimal damage, but the Curaçao sank almost immediately, and the lives of 338 British sailors were lost. Shaken but safely on dry land in Scotland, the division moved by train to London, England, and from there to the Tidworth Barracks, just 10 miles from historic Stonehenge. It was the beginning of the division's training program that would last until May of 44, the longest of any American infantrymen in World War II. On May 18th of 44, the 116th Regiment were taken in trucks to containment camps on the southeast coast of England. The countdown to D-Day had begun. On the morning of June 6 of 44, Staff Sergeant Wright, Staff Sergeant Williams, and Technical Sergeant Draper were all on separate landing crafts heading for Omaha Beach at Normandy. Company A of the 116th was to lead the D-Day assault. As you now know, as the landing crafts approached the beach, the enemy opened fire with heavy artillery, mortar, and machine gun and small arms fire. Frank Draper was known to be calm and decisive under pressure, but he was totally unprepared for what was about to happen. Draper's craft violently shook with the horrifying impact of an anti-personnel shell that ripped through the metal side of his boat and tore off his arm. Rapidly losing blood, the young soldier slumped to the floor, and I'm sorry to say it, Frank Draper died before he could even get off that boat. Elmer's landing craft made it just short of the beach, and as the ramp dropped, the men were met with a hail of enemy fire. Most were killed outright. Others lay critically wounded, screaming for help. Those that could jumped into the 6 feet of water and desperately tried to make their way to the beach. Elmer was killed in the hail of gunfire almost as soon as he hit the beach. It was not until July 16 that the news of the horrendous losses suffered by Company A reached the town of Bedford. 19 local Bedford boys died in the first bloody minutes at Normandy. 2 more died later that day. As I said, no other town in America suffered a greater loss. Details of Maurice Williams' death are unfortunately unknown. All we know is that he did die that day on the beach. Elmer Wright was 28 years old. Frank Draper was 25. Maurice Williams was 26. Louis Alberijo. He was born in Cranston, Rhode Island on February 19 of 1917. He served in the 243rd Coastal Artillery Regiment of the National Guard and went to work for the local Fruit of the Loom mill. He was rated one of the best players in local diamond history and was playing semi-pro ball with the Pontiac Men's Club and the Dyers Federation, attracting the attention of the St. Louis Cardinals. But on September 16th of 1940, the 243rd Coastal Artillery Regiment was mobilized and sent to Fort Adams at Narragansett Bay. Louis was sent to England with the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division, in 1943, where he would be involved in military training and preparation for D-Day. At the end of September of 43, the 26-year-old third baseman played for the 116th Infantry Regiment Yankees in the ETO World Series, a 4-day, 16-team event to find the U.S. Armed Forces Champion of Europe. The troops of the 116th Infantry Regiment were among the first to face the devastating enemy barrage at Omaha Beach. You're probably starting to see a pattern here, but Louis was in one of the landing crafts making its way to the beach when it started to take on heavy machine gun fire and mortar fire. Men leapt from the landing craft into the water. The onslaught of artillery and machine gun fire virtually annihilated that first wave of the 116th. Exact details of his death are unknown, but among the men killed on the beach was 27-year-old Private First Class Louis Alberijo. As of the publishing of this video, these are the 6 professional ball players known to have died during Operation Overlord. And thank you for your time. Take care.